My mother handed me a coffee mug with "World's Best Boss" on it at the company Christmas party in front of 40 employees. 11 days later, a filing at the Secretary of State's office told me I wasn't a boss at all. I wasn't even an owner anymore. This is still Waters. Here's what he wrote. My dad started Whitfield Construction in a rented garage the year I was born, 31 years ago. I'm Daniel. I'm 34, and I've worked there in some capacity since I was 14, sweeping job sites for gas money. When Dad got the pancreatic cancer diagnosis 3 years ago, he didn't have some long, cinematic goodbye. He had 11 weeks. In week 6, sitting in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic, and the protein shakes he couldn't keep down, he told me the company was mine to run. Not someday. Now. He said it in front of my mother, my older sister Colleen, and my younger brother Patrick, and none of them argued, because at that point, none of them had ever worked a single day inside that business but me. The will, when it was finally read 4 months after he died, split ownership 4 ways, 25% each to my mother, Colleen, Patrick, and me. Equal. Dad's lawyer, a tired, decent man named Arthur Belding, who'd known our family 20 years, told me privately that Dad's real intention, the thing he'd said out loud in that hospital room but never got around to putting on paper before he went downhill fast, was for me to eventually hold a controlling stake, since I was the one actually running the place. Arthur said Dad kept meaning to amend it. Dad ran out of time. I didn't fight the will. I trusted my family to eventually get around to what Dad actually wanted, the way you trust people you've known your whole life instead of the way you trust a signed document. For the next 2.5 years, I ran that company like it was still just me and Dad in that garage. I was on site by 6 a.m. most mornings, bidding jobs, managing 41 employees, personally co-signing the equipment loans because the business's credit wasn't quite there yet, but mine, post-recession, was better. When cash flow seized up 8 months ago, a client on a $340,000 commercial job went sideways on payment for 11 weeks. I covered 2 full payroll cycles out of my personal savings, about $61,000 total, so nobody on my crew missed a mortgage payment. I told myself that's just what owners do. I didn't ask my mother, Colleen, or Patrick to chip in a dollar of it. None of them offered. My mother handled the books loosely, the way she always had. Dad's old system, mostly trust, a bookkeeper named Renata, who came in twice a month. Colleen worked a full-time job in pharmaceutical sales and treated her 25% like a stock she'd forgotten she owned, showing up maybe twice a year to ask when distributions were coming. Patrick was the one who worried me, though I didn't let myself think hard about why for a long time. He'd started consulting, his word, for a competitor 2 towns over, Kessler Brothers, an outfit that had been quietly underbidding us on municipal contracts for the better part of a year. Contracts we used to win without a fight. Anyone who's caught themselves rationalizing a bad feeling about a family member for months, because facing it head-on felt worse than just living with the doubt, already knows the 8 months I'm about to describe. One Tuesday from that stretch sums up the whole shape of what was coming, so let me lay it out hour by hour. 5:45 a.m., on site at the Delacroix warehouse job, walking the framing crew through a change order. 9:30, on the phone with our bank's commercial lender, personally guaranteeing a $180,000 equipment line because the business's own credit was still recovering from the payment gap. 12:15, lunch at my desk, reviewing a bid for a school district contract I'd spent 11 days pricing to the dollar. 3 o'clock, a call from Renata, our bookkeeper, mentioning almost offhand that Patrick had asked her for the full cap table the week before. Ownership percentages, member units, the whole structure, which struck me as strange only because Patrick had never in his life asked a bookkeeping question. I told myself he was probably just curious. I filed it away instead of asking him directly. That's the part I still can't fully explain to myself now. Looking back, I had the thread in my hand and I let it go. By 6 p.m. that day, I was back on site, closing up, and I didn't think about Patrick's question again for almost 3 weeks. That Christmas party, the mug, world's best boss, 40 employees clapping, my mother genuinely misty-eyed handing it to me, happened on a Friday. I don't think my mother knew yet what Patrick and Colleen had already set in motion. I think she was proud of me in that moment, sincerely. That's what makes what came next land the way it did. 11 days later, a subcontractor I'd worked with for a decade, an electrician named Osei, who did side work pulling public records for other GCs, called me on a Tuesday morning with a strange question. He asked if we'd recently restructured the company because he'd pulled a standard vendor verification report, something GCs run on each other constantly. Nothing sinister about the request itself. And Whitfield Construction's registered agent filing showed new membership percentages, filed 6 weeks earlier. My name wasn't listed at 25% anymore. It was listed at 4%. I sat in my truck in a job site parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself pull the filing directly instead of trusting a secondhand description of it. It was real. An amended operating agreement, filed with the state, signed by my mother as majority holder at the time of filing, reallocating membership units. My mother down to 30%, Colleen up to 33%, Patrick up to 33%, and me diluted from 25% down to 4%. The stated reason on the internal resolution attached to the filing, I got a copy from Arthur 2 days later, was that my compensation as an employee was being formally separated from my equity position, and that my equity had been adjusted to reflect prior distributions and personal draws. I had taken exactly 0 personal draws beyond my standard salary in 2.5 years. I had the bank statements to prove it, because I'd been the one covering payroll out of my own account, not the other way around. I called Patrick first, because some instinct told me this had his fingerprints on it more than my mother's. He didn't deny it. He said, almost bored, that Mom had been worried I was treating the business like it was already fully yours, and that Colleen agreed it was time to formalize things properly. He said the word formalize like it was a kindness he was doing me. Then he said the sentence I've turned over in my head more than any other sentence in this whole story. You'll still run it day to day, Dan. Nothing really changes for you. Nothing changes. Coming from the man who just cut my ownership by 84%, while I was the one who'd personally guaranteed the equipment loans, still sitting on my own credit. I called my mother that night. She cried, genuinely, and told me Patrick and Colleen had come to her together with paperwork already drafted. Told her it was standard practice to protect the business from me potentially leaving or getting divorced someday and walking away with a quarter of a company I hadn't built. She signed because she trusted her other 2 children to have thought it through, and because, her words, "You've always been the responsible one, sweetheart. You'd never actually leave." I asked her if she understood that she'd just voted, as majority holder, to functionally erase my ownership while I was still personally on the hook for the company's debt. She went quiet in a way that told me she genuinely hadn't put those 2 facts next to each other until I said it out loud. Here's what I didn't do that week, and I think it matters that I tell you. I didn't quit. I didn't blow up the group chat. I went to work the next morning at 5:45, like always, because 41 employees and their families didn't have anything to do with what my siblings had just tried to pull, and punishing the job site wasn't going to fix the cap table. What I did instead was call Arthur, Dad's old lawyer, and then a second attorney he referred me to, a corporate specialist named Priya Okafor, who'd handled exactly this kind of dispute before. She told me something within the first 10 minutes that changed how I understood my own position. Because I'd personally guaranteed over $500,000 in business debt, the equipment lines, a truck fleet loan, and a line of credit I'd signed for during the payment gap. I had leverage that had nothing to do with my membership percentage on paper. No bank was going to let the company refinance or draw on any of those lines without my personal signature, regardless of what the operating agreement said my ownership stake was. Patrick and Colleen had diluted my equity. They hadn't touched my exposure. Priya also pulled something I hadn't thought to look for. The original operating agreement, the one filed when Dad incorporated, had a clause requiring unanimous member consent, not just majority, for any amendment altering a member's percentage below 20%. My mother, as majority holder, had filed the amendment believing majority vote was sufficient. It wasn't. The amendment was defective from the moment it was filed. I didn't tell Patrick or Colleen what Priya found. I let 3 weeks pass exactly the way they expected them to. Me showing up, running jobs, saying nothing, because from where they sat, I'd absorbed it the way I usually absorb things. The moment it actually surfaced was a Thursday, at a lender meeting Patrick had scheduled, without fully looping me in, trying to draw an additional $220,000 against the equipment line to fund a new job Kessler Brothers had somehow lost to us at the last minute. A detail I'd later learn wasn't a coincidence at all. The loan officer, a straightforward woman named Deb, who'd worked with our family for a decade, slid the paperwork across the table and needed my signature as personal guarantor. I read the amended member list sitting in the loan file, the one listing my ownership at 4%, and I set the pen down. I told Deb, in front of Patrick and my mother, that I wasn't comfortable personally guaranteeing an additional $220,000 in debt for a company where my ownership had just been cut to a number that wouldn't survive contact with a calculator, and that before I signed anything else, the amendment authorizing that reduction needed to be reviewed, because I had reason to believe it wasn't validly executed under the company's own governing documents. Patrick's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before. Deb, to her enormous credit, said she wasn't going to process any new guarantee until ownership was clarified, and the meeting ended 11 minutes after it started. Colleen called me that night, not defensive at first, mostly confused, asking why I was blowing up a formality over paperwork she assumed I'd basically agreed to by not fighting it in the first 3 weeks. I told her the amendment required unanimous consent under the original operating agreement, that I'd never consented to anything, and that as far as any bank, court, or future buyer was concerned, my ownership was still legally 25%. She went quiet, and then asked the question that told me she understood exactly what she and Patrick had actually done. Does that mean we need to redo the whole thing? Yes, it meant exactly that. Priya drafted a formal notice to my mother, Colleen, and Patrick, laying out the defective amendment and requesting it be voided and refiled correctly, this time with my actual consent, which I'd told them plainly I would not be giving unless my stake reflected what Dad had told Arthur was his real intention before he died. Controlling interest, given that I was the one running the company and personally carrying its debt. What followed wasn't a courtroom fight, though Priya told me honestly it could have become one. It became 3 weeks of very uncomfortable, very quiet negotiation, mostly conducted through lawyers, occasionally through my mother crying on the phone asking why we couldn't just go back to how it was before all this. I told her there wasn't a version of before I was interested in going back to. The amendment had shown me exactly how the three of them thought about what I'd built, whether or not they'd fully meant it that way. We settled on new terms. My mother retained 15%. Colleen and Patrick each dropped to 15%, and I hold 55%, controlling interest, formally reflecting what Dad had told his lawyer in that hospital room 3 years earlier. It's on file with the state now, executed correctly, unanimous consent documented, notarized, no ambiguity left for anyone to quietly amend 6 weeks after a Christmas party. Patrick doesn't work with Kessler Brothers anymore. That came out during the renegotiation. Priya's discovery request turned up that he'd been feeding them our bid numbers on 2 municipal jobs over the prior 5 months. The same stretch where they'd started beating us on contracts we used to win outright in exchange for a finder's fee on jobs Kessler picked up because of it. He called it keeping his options open. I called it exactly what it was in the settlement documents, and it's the reason his final percentage landed lower than Colleen's. My mother apologized to me in a way I actually believed, eventually. Not right away, but about 2 months after the dust settled, sitting at her kitchen table, saying she'd let herself believe what was easiest to believe because looking at the alternative meant admitting 2 of her kids had tried to quietly take something from the third one while he was too busy carrying the company to notice. I told her I understood why she wanted to believe that. I also told her belief isn't the same as a signature, and hers was the signature that mattered most on that original defective filing. Colleen still calls occasionally, mostly business-related now, direct and a little formal in a way our relationship never used to be. We're not close the way we were. I don't know if we will be again, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. The company had its best year on record this year. $4.1 million in contracts. The school district job I bid 11 days for finally broke ground in March, and I hired a full-time controller, so no single bookkeeper ever holds that much quiet control over the cap table again. That part wasn't punishment. That was just common sense, arriving 8 months too late to save me the worst month of my professional life. I still have the mug. World's best boss. A little chipped on the handle now. I use it every morning. Not because the joke's funny anymore. Because I earned the thing it says, on paper, with my name on it, in a filing nobody can quietly amend without my signature ever again. So here's what I keep wondering. How many people get handed a mug, a title, a pat on the back, while somewhere behind them, on paper, they're quietly being written out of the thing they actually built? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.